I want to talk today about personal projects, mainly because I'm like literally right in the middle of a personal project. Perhaps one of my bigger personal projects that I have worked on. It's called Retry Rabbit, and I just made a video about it. It's basically a utility type application that will allow you to replay messages to your queues in RabbitMQ. But I want to talk today more broadly about personal projects because I think at least for what happens to me when I start a project is that I think it's the greatest idea ever, ever conceived. I made this awesome idea. It's great, and then I start to get into the code, and I get about 5 to 10% of the way there, and then I just kind of stop, and then I'm like, well, this is pretty much the worst thing I've ever made in my life. And then nothing ever happens. And I let the idea, go off into the black box that is the universe. And I think it's unfortunate because I think that what happens with personal projects is that you start, but then you all of a sudden lose all the energy, and then and then it takes even more energy to climb back up the hill. And it's you have to really just continue despite how you may feel about it in the moment, right? Even if you're making a simple like weather app, right? Even though it's been done many many times, that's not really the point. The point is for you to just make and produce something, regardless of if it's been done or how the quality. But the more you begin to get familiarized with the software development lifecycle, the better you're gonna get better at it the more you do it. And that's really what personal projects should be. They shouldn't be, making the next big tech startup, regardless of what YouTube videos you may see. The personal projects are first and foremost for you, and they're a tool designed to help you learn. And if you're not really learning and you're just making something to make something, then what's the point? But for me, what I've noticed is when I start a project, I come into it with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy. I think it's going to be awesome. But then I get like 1 to 2 days, usually about 2 days into it, and then I just lose like all my energy on it, and then I just stop. And I think for me, what has helped me get over that hurdle, like that the energy loss, wall, if you want to call it that, is to not try to implement every feature that you think of, but just stick to like the baseline functionality. What is it that this app at its core needs to do to accomplish part of the goal that you're setting out to do, right? It doesn't matter if you have the right filtering on your table, for example, because that's something that I have to do on my personal project. It doesn't matter if you have all the bugs, squared away. It doesn't matter if it looks the best. That stuff doesn't matter. At the end of the day, does it get from point A to point B somewhat? Does it accomplish the functionality at least a little bit of what you're trying to do? That is at least how I've been able to continue this project, is to not get overburdened with all the little stuff that I want to do. Because I'll tell you right now that the number one thing that drains my energy in the software development world is front end development. I just can't stand doing front end development. I mean, I don't like it. Like, I don't dislike it that much. Like, I don't like it a lot. But when I'm like just going back and forth with like style changes and trying to format things and get things to just show up in a clean way, that to me is just exhausting, because I feel like a lot of it is just like me like refreshing and like hoping for the best. I just don't like that kind of programming. I much more enjoy stepping through and debugging on the back end side of things. So that's where I get energy out of, is back end development. So I have to make sure that I'm doing a healthy amount of back end programming while I'm doing front end. If all I'm doing is front end programming, I'm like guaranteed to like I'm like guaranteed to stop working on the project at the end of the day and then like never touching it again. So I have to make sure that I like intersperse back end development, or honestly keep back end development the main thing and just like barely do any front end development. That's how I have to do it personally in order to maintain enough drive to at least finish the project, so to speak, at least to a degree where it actually works. And that's the strategy that I've had to use for this last project. Is I've had to like solely do back end development like 80% of the time, because that's just where my interests lie, and that's really where I'm trying to improve and get better at. I don't really care so much about front end programming. Like, I don't personally see myself going into like a front end focused career. And that's kind of the inspiration behind that video I made where we talked about front end frameworks. I just really don't care much about them. I would much rather just use pure JavaScript and just make something in like an MVC, Razor style. That way I can just use C# and just do JavaScript when I have to, and I can just do calls to the back end and return JSON, and it all works well. And it does everything I need it to do. And I don't have to like use all these frameworks and learn stuff that I don't feel like I'm going to use ever again. And so if you're working on a project, just like try to not get bogged down on something that doesn't interest you. Try to make sure that the primary focus of your personal project is something that you're really interested in. So again, for me, it's .NET. So a majority of my time is going to be focused on the .NET side of things and trying to think of innovative and different approaches to how to solve the problems. And I'll tell you right now, one thing that I'm going to be making content on the channel around is converting more object-oriented style programming into more of a functional approach, and how do you incorporate solid principles to heavily refactor your code. So that's going to be some content that we have coming on the channel. But that's a goal, is I'm always trying to learn functional programming more and incorporate that into my regular workflow. So part of the reason I'm doing personal projects is to get better at thinking functionally and to get better at writing functional code on the first draft, as opposed to going back and having to refactor it into functional code after the fact. So that's one thing I'm trying to set out to do in this personal project. So I would try to stick with a goal, have a goal in mind. If your goal is to learn how to connect to a database, then your application just needs to connect to a database. You can download MySQL, start a MySQL server, load the connection string into your application, and, just play around with that. And then from there, you can learn migrations. From there, you can learn how to interact with the database with Entity Framework, how to do it with raw SQL. There's so much you can do, and you can learn about transactions. You can learn about distributed transactions if you want to get into that. You can learn about sagas. There's so much you can learn from that, and you can all incorporate that into a personal project. Whether it needs it or not is really beside the point. It's really for you to learn the technical skills, but also develop your thinking, so you can think about all these solutions in the real world if the problem arises. And another thing you can think about is, if your goal is to deploy an application, you might want to explore, okay, which provider am I going to deploy to? Am I going to deploy to AWS? Am I going to deploy to Azure? Where are you going to deploy to? And also, how are you going to make the file to deploy that? What's going to be your CI/CD tool to help you do that? So your personal project, you can learn about that. Again, if it's like try to make it specific. Another example for me of a specific personal project was that 2-stroke engine simulator, because I specifically wanted to target event-driven development, and that's where I really got into RabbitMQ, and I documented the whole thing on the channel. But that was really the inspiration for that project, is to use RabbitMQ to drive a system and how different microservices can communicate to each other, via messages. And so that's why I did that personal project, was so that I can learn RabbitMQ. And after 2 years, I feel like I've accomplished that goal. So the goal with this project, again, is more, driving towards more functional style programming. as well as actually just extending on my RabbitMQ knowledge. But I'm not really like trying to make something, if that makes sense. I think people get stuck on the trying to make something revolutionary, or getting stuck on like not having an idea, when at the end of the day, that's not really what it's about, to be honest. Nobody really cares like what your idea is when it comes to personal projects. They just care about what you've used in them to accomplish the goal. So if you're able to articulate, here is what my objective was, here's how I planned to go about solving that problem, here's the steps that I took, here is my development process, and here's the output. If you can talk holistically about that life cycle, that's going to put you in a really, really good spot for interviews, but also just developing your thinking about the software development life cycle. We've talked about on this channel many times, but coding is like a quarter of the battle, right? The other 75% comes down to communication skills. Honestly, that's like 50% of the job is communication skills. You got to stay organized with your development. You got to keep track of what needs to be done and what has been done and what has been deployed and what needs to be deployed. So there's a lot of organization there. You got to keep track of who is working where and what files to hopefully avoid some degree of merge conflicts, but sometimes it's unavoidable. But there's a lot of organization. There's a lot of planning that goes into this job that's not really taught aside from learning on the job, unfortunately. But if you can talk about that and how you went about that life cycle in your personal project, I think that's going to be really good and really effective. But again, it's like anything. You have to be able to articulate that in a succinct and meaningful way. So on your resume, it's one thing to say like I made a personal project in .NET and I don't know, .NET and RabbitMQ. That's one thing, right? And that's like you're like halfway there, but you have to also describe your planning process. You have to describe what the project does on a whole. Like if it's an API, describe what the data returns. If it's a weather app, describe the value that it brings. And just talk about how you set out about doing that. Because unfortunately now, right, you can go into some kind of AI tool and tell you, hey, this is kind of like what I want to make, and it'll give you some of the code and you can copy and paste some of it and then just kind of like fumble around to get it to the last spot. So listing just technologies is not really going to cut it now, just because of where we are kind of at with a lot of these new tools. So it really, at the end of the day, still comes down to your ability to describe and effectively communicate both in a technical and non-technical way about what it is that you're making. Because it's one thing to describe it in a technical way, and if you're talking to technically minded people, they're going to understand that and probably ask you questions to dig deeper into certain things. But if you're talking to somebody who is not a software developer, they're not going to be able to like understand in the same way what you're talking about. So they're not going to see the same value of maybe a particular choice of technology here, because they're not coming from the same perspective, right? They're not going to see the value. So some of that might be lost if you're not able to translate that appropriately. And that's a big thing. So that's, if you're working on a personal project, don't neglect that part of it, right? Definitely make sure that you write up documentation, write up at least have a good readme about what it is you're making, but try to translate that well in your resume. Try to effectively discuss what the project is, and don't undersell yourself. Definitely don't feel like your project isn't good enough, because again, that's not what the goal and purpose of personal projects is, right? When I started out as a software developer, my personal projects, I made a quote of the day application. I made just like a CRUD .NET application. I'm trying to think what else. I made like a random number generator. Like I just did I just did like really basic stuff. But I described them. I talked about them, and I made a website where I kind of like showed like, hey, these are my projects. You know, here's my whole portfolio. Here's my plan for my future projects, and so on and so forth. You're not limited to like, you know, this singular project you're working on now. Be descriptive about it and list all your projects that you've worked on. And you know, if you built something in Python to, I don't know, do something with data, talk about that. If you're planning on making a .NET, you know, API, talk about your plan to make that, and try to be descriptive and be honest about what you're doing. But don't undersell yourself. Definitely try to be confident about what it is you're doing. And you know, it's again, it's difficult to talk about this stuff, and it's difficult to maintain drive to finish personal projects, because sometimes it can kind of feel pretty defeating when you've invested so much like mental energy thinking about a personal project, and then it doesn't really pan out that much. It doesn't really come to, you know, fruition. That can be tiring, and there's been moments where I've like questioned, like, you know, why am I spending my time doing this? But I think down the road you're going to look back and be proud of yourself for seeing these projects through, but you're going to be proud of what you made, and you're going to be excited to see how far you've come. And if there was anything I've gotten from my personal projects, it's the fact that I can go back and see my own progress, and that to me gives me a lot of motivation to continue, because I can track where I've been and where I'm going. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you in the next one.